Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. The Pharmacy Inspection Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, delivering quality and meaningful conversations and discussions about our pharmacy industry and the critical role pharmacists play in our healthcare systems. Learn more at pharmacypodcast.com. Please welcome your hosts, Brian Prince and Seth DePasquale.
Hello to all of our compounding friends and colleagues out there, and welcome to the third week of the new year 2018. I hope something exciting has happened for you thus far, because I'm looking forward to this year, and I'm also looking forward to this episode number 10, because this week we welcome a really good friend of mine by the name of Dillon. I will openly credit Rad with mentoring me and guiding me through my early career decision as a consultant in the compounding industry, and like weeks previous with John Pritchett and Joe Caballero and Bill Mixon, I often call Rad to discuss ideas, to ask for clarification, and lots of technical things, and I always enjoy our conversations. The most important lesson here for me, and looking back at my friends over weeks previous, and the lesson that I want to share with you, is build a network of industry colleagues and friends. When we openly share our knowledge, wonderful ideas will emerge, and great things can happen. I know that to be true, and so that's why I want to share with you. Rad, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your journey into this industry.
Yeah, well, I was graduated from pharmacy school in 1981, way back in the dark ages, and immediately went into hospital practice because that's what I thought I wanted to do, but started bouncing around and found myself in home infusion when it was still relatively new, 1986. I certainly wasn't one of the old timers on that, but there was still a lot going on, and I worked with the old leader in the area called Caremark, and really took to home infusion. It was an awesome area of endeavor, and I started working. I mean, it's a fairly turnover and change conducive industry. So there are a lot of mergers, a lot of acquisitions, lots of change of people. So sometimes I turn out well ahead in those kind of things, and sometimes not so much. But floated around with some of the other large names in the company and some regional companies. I was usually either in direct management with them, or I was like a supportive role like corporate pharmacy manager or something along those lines, or quality manager, and we're helping branches. So I was out in a lot of branches a lot of the time. I like travel, and it's interesting we see how people are doing things. As the years went by, I also had some time in long-term care pharmacy, and very recently here in what is considered, classic compounding pharmacy, sterile and non-sterile, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there as well. Last 4 years of my life, I have basically decided to be my own boss and divide my time between being a surveyor for ACHCP cab, meaning I go in and see home infusion pharmacies, I see sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacies, I see specialty pharmacies. And when I'm not doing that, I'm doing consulting and a lot of technical writing. I wrote a SOP manual or two along these lines. So now here I am living in lovely Loveland, Colorado, looking out on the Front Range from my apartment window. So life is good. Nice. I'm on the road a lot, but I'm doing some karmically good stuff out there. I'm not just surveying people and writing them up, but then getting to help recommend how they can get better and take care of their deficiencies.
Awesome. You You've written a couple SOP manuals. Man, that sounds like a very daunting task.
Well,
Wow.
I'll tell you how. Yeah, the way that kind of came about is when I started surveying in the PCAB realm. I was realizing how awful a lot of people's SOPs were, to be quite honest, and what I saw out there on the market really wasn't all that good. So, once upon a time, I had a professor who said, if you really want to get to know something, write a book about it. So I thought, well, you know what? I'll just write an SOP manual. So what it tends to do is to kind of stick to the subject of what does the PCAB standards say it wants. So I wrote the SOP along those lines, and not beating around the bush, just meeting those criteria. And then, of course, the critical thing is if you're the pharmacy that buys this book, you have to customize it. Obviously, then you have to edit it to make it actually apply to your situation.
Right. And which, to me is like probably the kiss of death. Like I just, I, I actually have a hard time sitting down and customizing an SOP manual just to like fit my own needs, let alone writing a whole SOP manual. So I got to hand it to you. That's crazy. That's awesome.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. What is the hazardous drug consensus group? How did that get started, and why I guess did you get it started?
Yeah, well, when USB 800 first came out, I was glad to see that there was some guidance being put out there, but it didn't take very long to realize that there were some definite issues with it. It did not cover a lot of very important topics, even ones that it expected people to do. Let's say some of the prime examples being personal protective equipment, PPE, and an assessment of risk. I mean, these are things you must do, and yet there was really very little concrete guidance when you started to jump into the thing. And then it didn't take long to find that some bright people out there who I knew either as surveyors or just through industry connections were kind of feeling the same way. So almost before we knew it, we were forming up a kind of an informal group. It's gotten a little more formal since then, but pulling in people, very diverse backgrounds, like Brian with his knowledge of containment equipment and PPE and workflow, and people like Joe and Bill Mixon and a variety of other people. And when the process got going, I realized, this will be cool. Let's intentionally pull some people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So we have, some hospital-based people. We have some people that, are not pharmacists. They're just representing, let's say, analytical labs, et cetera. So as often happens in a lot of times you pull people together like this, there's a small group of people who are kind of like doing most of the work just because they're really focused on it. I'm not trying to say that the other folks aren't valued members, but I guess we just think a lot more about this topic than some other people, and we're just appreciative of having every member at least gets to review it and comment upon it when we do things. But so last spring we came out with the consensus statement, the hazardous drug consensus statement, and we had the good fortune that ACHC PCAB and IACP both co-sponsored it, and you will find it available for free download on the ACHC website and on the Compounding Today website, which is kind of like the unofficial site for IAPC and IJCP. So it's out there. There are some other tools there as well. It's kind of hard to get it the publicity we'd like out there. I mean, it's a free thing, and a lot of work went into it. What we especially intended to do, and I think we succeeded pretty well, is that we came up with something that not only was a good synopsis of 800, kind of in a little more plain language, but whenever there were instances when 800 really didn't talk to a sufficient level of detail, we offered best practice recommendations, and we made it really clear when we were doing that so people wouldn't think, oh, I guess I have to do this, we'd say a best practice recommendation is as follows. So we put it together. It's out there. We're almost certainly going to have a second edition coming out first quarter of next year. And one thing that's very interesting is these topics that we cover continue to evolve. We're still having a little subcommittee conference calls and all to hammer out and further define some of these topics. So it's kind of a living topic, how to handle hazardous drugs appropriately. So I'm glad we did it. I hope that we can get a lot of people to download it, read through it, and find it helpful.
Rad is being very modest in his effort and kind of explaining all this. This was quite the ordeal, and he was, in my opinion, the glue, almost the sole person who took this on as a task and really put this group together. And then when all the group and we gave our feedback on our sections, and there was about 12 of us, Rad, I believe, on the initial committee. Yeah. And so as we would give back our feedbacks, then Rad would take all of that, dissect that information, and then put it into that document. So Rad, I must give you serious kudos on that, because you were the glue that held this thing together, and then you were ultimately the end author who pushed it downfield. So we gave the pieces, but you put it all together as that big puzzle and got that out there. So for me, when you mentioned best practices, the best practices are, again, that's kind of the internal glue that holds all the other pieces. Because the thing that, the chapter 800 was somewhat vague on were, intimate and small details, such as how do you achieve negative pressure? How do you handle pre-sterilization weighing? How do you, deactivate, contaminate? And so those are things that the chapter said that you must do or you should do, but then there wasn't that intimate detail that said, well, how do we do that? What are those best practices? And so to me, that was the best part of the entire document, is putting those best practices out there.
Well, I appreciate that, Brian. I mean, I enjoy doing things like this, bringing a bunch of bright people together and hammering out a consensus. It could be kind of tedious sometimes. I was thinking it's like when you have a bill moving through Congress and stuff. But, we eventually all worked out compromises and came out with some statements that everybody could agree on. So it was cool.
Aside from, the negative pressure thing, what are some other topics that the hazardous drug consensus statement tried to tackle? I know that when I could go on about, some of the things that I had issues with, but I find it interesting to hear about like what everybody else is having issues with and what exactly was clarified. I actually have not had a chance to read that whole hazardous drug consensus statement, I have to admit. So I apologize for that. But so what are some of the things in there that it tackles?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that some of the main issues of confusion continue to be personal protective equipment. I've talked about that before. And it's not even so much, okay, we understand this is the stuff you have to use. It's a matter of, well, when do you put it on? When do you take it off? And where are you standing when you're doing that? And as Brian can well attest, because he's a major contributor in that whole thing, that whole challenge, we put together a little diagram that literally, kind of like you're walking through the areas where you're handling and compounding the drugs, and says, put this on, take this off. So that was a huge area that we hope we are helpful on. Another one I already mentioned is about assessment of risk. There's a lot of confusion. Well, what can we do an assessment of risk on? What must we do one on? And what can we assess ourselves out of, so to speak? And the subcommittee involved in that is just, literally in the last few weeks, reached some really good consensus on what we can do along those lines. So we're wanting to get that out there. Some other areas Brian kind of alluded to also is, well, what kind of a room or rooms do I really have to have? And some people are thinking they're going to have to spend an awful lot more money than they probably need to. And then some people are thinking they can just take a cheap approach or an easy approach. And so that's definitely an area. A couple more are the concept of medical surveillance that is in 800, where you're monitoring the health of employees to look for early signs of problems due to hazardous drug exposure, and then environmental wipe sampling, which is a really good idea, but it was and still remains very challenging to find who can do this for you, how should you do it, what should you test for, et cetera, et cetera. So, Brian, maybe you can think of a few other hot topics, but these are ones I keep running into over and over there when I'm out surveying.
Yeah, what I did is I went in and really dissected and diagrammed out what is meant by redundant HEPA. And you would think that, because I live inside of the engineering world and I've come from, the hoods or the containment background, that, for me, understanding redundant HEPA is just a second nature, but it is still very unknown as what that means. As a matter of fact, I was just at the ASHP down in Orlando last week, and I had this conversation over and over and over. So what we did as part of the hazardous drug consensus statements, we actually went in and I diagrammed what does that mean. And there's still going to be a lot of education that goes out on just that subject. But one of the areas that I have used multiple times that we came up with was the risk assessment matrix. And what we did is we made the whole process of risk assessment very simple into a one-page spreadsheet. And whenever you come up with a concept and you introduce it into pharmacy, where our days are already strapped with time and there's never enough time to get everything done, you don't want to introduce a lot of paperwork, right? And so one of the things that we've done, again, that I've introduced out there is the assessment of risk, and that's in a matrix, which is just one page, and you can go through there in that matrix, and it's under a case study, I believe, somewhere around page 21, 22. And by the way, the chapter itself, USP 800, the chapter is around 20 pages, and our consensus statement is around between 90 and 100 pages. And that may sound overwhelming in the beginning, because we've already heard, Rad, and I'm sure you've heard this too, is that we're already getting folks out there that are actually they haven't read the chapter, or they haven't read it all the way through. And so how do we get them to then turn around and read a 90-some page consensus statement, then dissects it? Well, I feel like some of this is going to probably ultimately go to the designated person, whoever that is in whatever organization, for them to really dissect it. But again, the tools we put in there are really not to just fill pages, but the tools are in there to really help people make the process more simple. Would you agree with that statement, Rand?
Yeah, I would. I was just thinking an amusing analogy there is that usually when you have a whatever for dummies book, you would imply that it's probably going to be shorter than the original, but you're right. I mean, this is actually, our consensus statement is significantly larger than 800 is, because we feel like we just have to give a lot of examples and tools, and we make up questions and answers, because that's often an excellent way to get ideas across, is by posing questions and then answering them. So
I was just trying to look back in 800 and see if the environmental sampling, the wipe sampling, is written in such a way. Brian and I have talked about this now a couple times with a couple different people about using total organic carbon analysis to assess whether or not the surfaces are clean, rather than doing like an identification of some kind to see if your surfaces are clean. I'm kind of wondering if the chapter is written in such a way that you'd be able to get away with actually doing total carbon analysis, total organic carbon analysis, rather than what perhaps the chapter suggests with like an HPLC type thing.
Well, let's remember, I'm sorry if I didn't say this earlier, environmental wipe sampling I think is a good idea, but it is a should, not a must. So you don't have to do it. Okay. But I think some kind of method of finding out just what level of contamination you're still having, and being able to quantify it enough to at least see trends, I think that's a really good idea, and that could be done a variety of ways. I know there's been a very simple method that sometimes I will recommend to people, and that's just to get a little cheap little ultraviolet light and turn off all the lights and shine it around your hazardous drug facilities and your storage shelves. Certainly not every hazardous drug fluoresces, and not a lot of chemicals don't, but many do. So it's kind of like if you're seeing a lot of residues everywhere around on shelves, fixtures, equipment, then that probably means there's hazardous drugs there as well. So the idea is then if you do a deep clean, use deactivating substances, and then repeat the process, and you see a notable change, that's not enormously quantitative, but it sure beats the heck out of nothing. So sometimes people have really caught on to that and have actually used it, and, to good results. So I think there's a possibility of a wide range of options here, everything from very expensive, quantitative analyses looking for the exact drugs to some of the stuff you guys are thinking of and just a $10 ultraviolet light.
Yeah, I have recommended the UV flashlight. Every conference I've spoke at, I pull it out and I show it to everybody, and you can see people just get extremely excited about a $12 flashlight. But the reality is that it is a great qualitative method, and that's ultimately what we're going to end up with initially as it relates to surface sampling is just qualitative results. Is there presence of, and is that through the carbon method? Is it through an HPLC method? Well, once you get into more of an HPLC method, then we can start getting more of a quantitative data set, but then that gets to be very expensive as well. So I don't know that we've absolutely solved this issue yet. And I think maybe a guest for us in the future would possibly be somebody from a third-party analytical lab that can really just help us understand, the qualitative versus the quantitative result. Because think about it, from a quantitative result, what are we comparing those results against? Right? Are there any benchmarks? Are there any standards that are set forth that there's only an allowable X amount of that particular chemical? Well, that data just doesn't exist. So, again, there's going to continue to be a little bit of subjectivity within that. But the good news is it's a should and not a must, although it really should be happening. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point in that, let's suppose and we either detect there's a lot of contamination on equipment or hardly any that we can detect. Well, but the ultimate issue, as Brian will readily admit, is, but how much of that is being ingested? And then if you're ingesting it, how much is acceptable? And we just don't know on a lot of these products and drugs. And that's a huge thing. If your PPE and your procedures are really good, you might be able to hypothetically work on a rather contaminated environment that absorb none of this. So it's a lot of work's going to be needed in this regard.
Yeah, and I will oftentimes direct folks to the toxicology section of the SDS sheets, the safety data sheets, and it'll say sometimes whether or not that was an oral or an inhalation, if there's even that data available. And sometimes we get chemicals where it says no data available, and I believe that tox section is like section 11 of the SDS. But so there's ocular exposure, there's dermal exposure, there's inhalation exposure. There's so many different routes of exposure. And so, yeah, that's a great point. Is it just because there is a presence on a surface and we've detected that, what is it? What is the real personnel exposure from that? Well, that's again, quantitative data sets that we don't have either. And I don't know how to really achieve that. That's probably a little beyond my comprehension at this point. So, Brad, tell us your thoughts on the pending USP 797. So that the delay happened with 800 about 6 weeks ago, and they said that they wanted to harmonize 797 with 800. However, the last paragraph of that press release said we still encourage early adoption of 800. So that, again, tells me, in my humble opinion, that there's more of a harmonization with 797. So what are your thoughts on the harmonizations, and or are you putting together a consensus group? I already know the answer, but I still have to ask it for the podcast. Are you putting together another consensus group to say, okay, let's also tackle this one as it comes out as well, even though there's still a lot of things up in the air?
Well, yeah, and I completely understand why USP wanted to coordinate these so that 800 and a new 797 would basically have the same effective date. Originally, that was to be July 1 of 2018. Several things happened. I don't have any inside knowledge necessarily, but I think there was a lot of controversy and pushback on 800, which perhaps was one reason why they decided to delay its implementation. But one thing I do know is that an unprecedented number of comments were submitted with regard to the latest draft of 797 that came out last fall, and it has taken them a great deal of time, and I'm fully confident they are still digesting all of these comments and deciding what to do about them. I guess that's probably a good sign, because that means they're cogitating on them for their merits. But that then, with being honest that they just couldn't rush a document out for one more round of review, which they had pledged to do, and still have both of these implemented with an effective date of July 1, 2018 was just not going to happen. So they kicked the can down the road quite a bit further, which is probably good, in that I would really rather they carefully think about this and, come up with a new 797 draft that the most people out there as consumers think is a better product. I also think that we're going to have a situation in which, as Brian alluded, we're going to need to have a concerted effort to review whatever draft comes out next. And we have certainly not everyone that is on the hazardous drug consensus group as it stands now is particularly involved or experts in sterile compounding, but a lot of them are. And we've formed up a new group with some overlap called the Sterile Compounding Consensus Group. And what we intend to do is, when we get the next draft of 797 out there within a very short period of time, hopefully a couple weeks, we will be able to issue a consensus statement. Perhaps consensus statement is not quite the word yet, but it would be our opinion on the new draft. And if we see things we like, then we will certainly say that. If we see things that we still do not, we want to not only state that, but try to encourage people to, write their congressman, so to speak, and push back on that as well, so that when we finally have a final draft of the new 797, then we can go into a mode where we are, okay, it is what it is. This is what we're going to have to use. So let's make a consensus statement about how to actually implement it. I can already say, in terms of written style and coverage, the 797 draft that's out there now is much better, A, than the old 797, and B, 800. It's much easier to understand it, read it, see what they're talking about. That's kind of an issue aside of whether you agree with the content or not. But I think there'll still be a definite role in a consensus group that will help people understand and implement whatever the final version of 797 is.
Thanks, Rad, for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it. Great conversation. Rad's a surveyor for PCAB. Are you trying to get ready for your PCAB accreditation? There's a class coming up in Salt Lake City, February 7th and 8th, which my co-host Brian will be one of the instructors. They'll be talking about getting ready for an accreditation as well as hazardous drug handling. Head over to Accreditation University for more details and use PI 100 SLC for $100 off the class. That's Pharmacy Inspection 100 Salt Lake City for $100 off the class. Hey, we've also started an Alexa flash briefing that's available on Amazon devices like the Echo. It's called a Quality Minute Compounding Brief. My goal is to talk about quality assurance topics related to compounding pharmacy. I just posted the first one last week, and there's going to be another this week. These are meant to be quick bits of info to help you implement and improve the quality of your practice, all in under 5-minute chunks of time. I really hope you'll continue tuning into the podcast and check out the briefing. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have a question, comment, topic, or guest suggestion, please feel free to tweet at Pharmacy Inspect. Find me on Facebook, Instagram at Pharmacy Inspection. Email me at podcast@pharmacyinspection.com, or leave a voicemail directly on the site. We have some really cool guests lined up, including Lloyd Allen of the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Compounding, and Brenda Jensen and Jim Hack from Compounding Consultants, and many more in the weeks to come. So until next time, keep raising the bar.